This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. During the 18th century, the Russian Empire started to flex its imperial authority, seeking to expand in every direction. Competent rulers such as Peter the Great and Catherine the Great earned their monikers by establishing a state that could compete with the grandest powers. By the early 19th century, Russian Czars started to make a concerted effort to bring the isolated yet important region of the Caucasus under their control. Even though the Tsar's forces had defeated the traditional powers of the area, the Ottomans and the Persians, they'd soon find out that real control lay with the various mountainous peoples of the region. Whilst the Ottomans and Persians were often routed in battle against Russian armies, the tribes of Dagestan and Chechnya specifically would prove to be a far more difficult foe to subdue. A resistance movement soon developed, united under the banner of Islam, calling themselves Murids. Under a series of leaders, most famously Imam Shamil, the Murids would make Dagestan and Chechnya a graveyard for tens of thousands of Russian soldiers, as they stubbornly clung on to the hope of remaining independent against an aggressive foreign outside power. In a classic tale of David versus Goliath, for over 30 years the Murids would outmaneuver the juggernaut Russian army numerous times, before finally succumbing to the sad fate of defeat. The Caucasus mountain range has been one of the most linguistically and ethnically diverse areas in the world throughout history. The sheer cliffs start to turn into the rolling hills of endless grassland that is the Eurasian steppe. The lush valleys and imposing mountains simultaneously provided its inhabitants with a fertile area to settle in, as well as allowing them to defend it from invaders. Many of the peoples that live here have roots that tie them to ancient nomadic steppe tribes. Two groups that will be essential to our story are the Chechens, whose conversion to Islam post-16th century was relatively late in comparison to the second group, the Avars of Dagestan. They had gradually been Islamized after the 8th century Arab invasions and had established a mighty Khanate in the 13th century that still existed at the beginning of the 19th century. The intense diversity of the Caucasus was perhaps its biggest weakness and strength at the same time. The rivalries amongst them divided them, but it also made them proud warriors who were always willing to defend their mountaintop homes. The introduction of an aggressive outside imperial force that wanted to impose its will on these fiercely independent ethnic groups provided the platform for them to unite. Soon after the Treaty of Turkmenchay, many of them revolted. These independence movements quickly gained traction in two different areas. One of them was in the northwest Caucasus, centered around the Circassian and Abkhazian people. This will be the subject of a future video. In the northeast, another revolt broke out, centered mostly around various Dagestani and Chechen groups. Both Chechnya and Dagestan found common ground in this period through Sufism, particularly the Naqshbandi order. Devoted to the teachings of the Quran, Sufi leaders in the region sought to enact Sharia law in their homelands. So the prospect of a Christian overlord spurred Naqshbandi followers to take up arms and resist. Sufism would also play a major role in providing the resistance with its leaders. In fact, the popular name of this conflict, the Murid War, is connected to Sufism because a Murid is a Sufi student committed to the idea of spiritual enlightenment. Two of the resistance most formidable warriors were born within 5 years of each other and grew up together in the Dagestani village of Gimri, which rested at the top of a needle-like mountain. Ghazi Muhammad was the elder of the two men and was born in around 1793. The second was Shamil, born in 1797. Both were taught by Sarid of Arikani, a Naqshbandi teacher who instilled in his students the importance of adhering to Islamic orthodoxy, a topic that was especially relevant in the Caucasus, considering the region still held connections with its pagan past. Before we continue, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's video, CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a streaming site that offers award-winning and original documentary films, shows, and series that you wouldn't be able to find anywhere else. As viewers of Hikmah history, I'm sure you have an interest in finding out about the world, and with CuriosityStream's extensive library that releases new content every single week, you'll never stop learning about your favorite subjects. There really is something for everyone on this service. With documentaries on science, technology, food, and other subjects, CuriosityStream is catered to those who love to learn. Their historical content is naturally my favorite. I just finished watching Gallipoli 1915, which details how the Ottomans, through competent leadership and willpower, were able to repulse an Allied invasion in World War I. Another good one is The Spying Game, a 3-part series which breaks down the importance of spies in the Cold War rivalry between the USA and the USSR. CuriosityStream prides itself on its affordability, offering both monthly and yearly plans. For as little as $5 a month, you can gain access to thousands of hours of high-quality documentaries. Their platform is available on multiple devices, whether it's TV, computer, or mobile phone, making it possible for you to watch your favorite documentaries wherever, whenever. Go to curiositystream.com/hikmah or scan the QR code on screen for unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and non-fiction series. And as my subscribers, you get 25% off when you use the promo code HIKMAH. So click the link in the description below or go to curiositystream.com/hikmah and save 25% right now. The spark for conflict came in 1829 when Ghazi Muhammad returned to Gyumri. He had gone on a pilgrimage of sorts across Dagestan, preaching Islam but also trying to organize a resistance movement against the encroaching Russians. So he declared himself the Imam of Dagestan in the presence of his followers and promised to expel the Russian invaders from his people's land. In the process, establishing the bedrock of what would become known as the Caucasian Imamate. Ghazi quickly took over Gyumri and set about to expand his movement. Despite the martial prowess of the Dagestanis, they could not fight off the massive armies of Russia alone. If he was to have any chance, then Ghazi would have to unify some of the numerous ethnic groups of the Caucasus. So he started sending preachers northwards to convert some of the pagan Chechen communities. Finding success in southern Chechnya, but less so the further north the preachers went. Before Ghazi could set his sights on confronting the Russians, he had to take on the nearby Avar Khanate. Having come under Russian domination at the start of the 19th century, many Avars had become disgruntled with the heavy taxation placed upon them by the Czars' administrators, thereby making them a fruitful source of supporters for Ghazi's cause. So in 1830, Ghazi and Shamil led 2 columns totaling roughly 3,000 warriors from Gyumri to Kunzakh, the Avar capital. There, Khanum Pakhu Bikhi, the female ruler of the Avars, had organized a small garrison to resist the Imamate's forces under the command of her foster child, Haji Murad, a fierce and experienced young warrior who we will encounter numerous times in our story. Despite being outnumbered, the Avar Khanate was able to repulse the Murid attack. In the aftermath of the battle, the banner of the defeated army was recovered by the Avars, who then sent it to Russian-controlled Tbilisi in Georgia. This would have been the first time that a Russian official would see the banner of the Imamate, but certainly not the last, as it would sear itself into the next 30 years of Imperial Russian history. While Imam Ghazi returned to Gyumri to lick his wounds, the sleeping bear that was the Russian Empire had been awoken and started to descend upon this pocket of resistance. Baron Rosen, a Russian general, had been instructed to raid the countryside around Gyumri, laying waste to the land in what was a teaser for events to come. This imposed on Imam Ghazi the need to recruit more men for his cause. So he travelled north to Chechnya in a bid to convince local leaders to pledge their support to the Imamate. Back from replenishing his forces, Ghazi set about to take revenge for Rosen's raid earlier that year. Seeking a target for his first campaign against Russia itself, Ghazi chose the old Georgian military highway that ran parallel to the border of Russian-controlled Georgia and connected with newer Russian-made roads in the north. This military highway cut almost directly into the geographic center of the Caucasus Mountains and is a key reason why the northeastern and northwestern Caucasus revolts couldn't combine their forces. The highway was always heavily guarded and recently on edge from the revolt, which is why Imam Ghazi decided to strike at the most unexpected time. In the cold month of December, a huge successful raid across the highway was undertaken, severely undermining Russian operations in the area. Ghazi rested his army for the rest of the winter. Since Rosen's raid on Gyumri the year before, Ghazi knew that his operational headquarters was vulnerable to attacks. Thus he realized the importance of controlling the huge forest that surrounded Gyumri on all sides. The forest gave the Imamate the advantage and allowed for them to entrench themselves and hide among the canopies. In the spring of 1831, Ghazi's army used the forest to lure and rout 3 separate Russian armies. That summer, Russia would remove much of their military presence in the area to deal with a much larger Polish revolt in their western territories. Ghazi's scouts quickly noticed the sparsely populated Russian garrisons and moved to capitalize on the opportunity. The Imam's soldiers emerged from their forest stronghold, this time moving east to the Caspian Sea coastal city of Tarki. This was the center of the Turkic Shamkhalat of the Kumyks, which had pledged itself to Russia in the aftermath of the Treaty of Gulistan in 1813. The arrival of the Imam sparked an anti-Russian rebellion among the Kumyk, many of whom now moved to join and assist Ghazi as he besieged the city of Tarki. Within a few days, the Murids stormed the city and claimed it for the Imamate. But they would leave as soon as they came, as Russian reinforcements arrived a few days later and managed to recapture the city. Ghazi's forces were not discouraged. Their campaign was revolved around speed and guerrilla warfare. So they trekked north towards the Russian fort of Vnizafia, immediately putting it under siege. Word got out to Count Georgy Emanuel, a Serbian-born Russian general who was the commander of all Russian forces in the Caucasus mountain region. Upon the arrival of Emanuel's forces, not only was the siege broken, but the 2,500-strong Russian contingent gave chase to the fleeing Murids. Seeing that his forces had almost caught up to their enemies just outside of an approaching forest, Emanuel ordered his army to continue the pursuit. But the Russian general would soon find out that he was rushing into a trap. Imam Ghazi waited for the perfect moment to surprise the Russian force with a devastating volley from men hidden throughout the forest. When the silence was finally broken by screaming musket balls, 400 Russians were wounded or killed. General Emanuel himself was injured in the ambush and quickly ordered a retreat. The 62-year-old general made a full recovery, but retired shortly after. Russia would come to sorely miss his experience. After a quick resupply and return to Gyumri, the Murids marched north once again, this time passing the fort that they had previously attempted to capture. The army continued this endless march far north, covering 125 kilometers in just a few days to reach the Russian city of Kizilar on the banks of the Terek River. The city, expecting to be well in the safe zone, had only kept a small garrison to defend it. Imam Ghazi would exploit this and sack Kizilar after a short siege. This diversionary attack would lead the main Russian army, which was just outside Gyumri at this point, in a wild goose chase north to the now looted city. The Russians had not left without leaving a surprise for Ghazi. Upon entering the thick forests around Gyumri, he discovered all the bodies of the men that he had assigned to guard the forest. The Russians had taken no prisoners. After wintering in Gyumri, the Murids again emerged from their mountaintop to harass Russian armies and garrisons north of Gyumri in April of 1832. Meanwhile, a group of Chechen soldiers acting on their own accord decided to raid the old Georgian military highway, prompting a Russian expeditionary force to be sent out into western Chechnya. This, like so many other raids against Russia, was just bait. The Chechens did not back down, and as the Russian army advanced, they remained vigilant, standing guard on their cliffsides and watchtowers. These guard towers especially bogged down the invading army. One tower in particular held the whole Russian army for 3 whole days, being manned by only 2 Chechens. Throughout the summer, the Murids continued their baiting tactic and led Russian contingents into a forest where they would be ambushed by sharpshooters. As winter approached, Russian military activity in the area continued. A large army was spotted nearby Gyumri, where Imam Ghazi was staying with some 50 of his men. The commander of the Russian forces recognized how bleak the situation was for Ghazi and quickly sent his army to surround the house. As they came under attack, the Murids fortified themselves within the compound, but a desperate scene soon emerged, with many being shot as they tried to escape the house. It is said that Imam Ghazi simply sat calmly on his prayer rug, perhaps accepting that his time had finally come. Shamil, who was also trapped in the compound, was far less willing to accept death. In the midst of the chaos, Shamil jumped out of a window where he was met by Russian soldiers ready to cut him down. Against the odds, he overpowered them and escaped, not before he was stabbed in the chest with a bayonet. When the Russians finally kicked down the door, they found the dead Imam still on his prayer rug. The revolt's leader was now dead. His body and accompanying prayer rug were then sent to the Kumyk capital, where it was displayed for 3 days, reminding the locals what happens when you rebel against the Tsar. Gyumri was taken and destroyed. Shamil, who decided to lay low in his recovery, was also presumed to be dead. The Caucasian revolt lay in shambles. But in the absence of these 2 great men, a new Imam would take up the cause. Hamza Bek had been one of the few prominent members of the Imamate who was not killed on that day with Ghazi, so he quickly took up the mantle of Imam. With the founder of the movement gone, the Murids were not in a position to attack the Tsar's forces directly, So, Hamza Bek's first campaign followed in the footsteps of Ghazi by waging war against the Avar Khanate in 1834. An ethnic Avar himself, Hamza Bek was able to secure the surrender of the Khanate's capital, Kunzakh. In the aftermath, he ordered the execution of the Khanum and her sons. But he had miscalculated one part of this plan. He forgot about the Khanum's foster son, Haji Murad. The man who was later immortalized by the famed author Leo Tolstoy's novel, Murad swore on his honor that he would avenge his foster family and kill Hamza Bek. Revenge is often a sacred issue amongst the tribes of the Caucasus. A few months later, Murad, his brother Osman and a few others entered the mosque in Kunzakh with no intentions of praying. The armed men quietly walked in, opened fire and killed Imam Hamza Bek and a few of his guards. Osman, who had been the first to shoot, was killed in the combat, showing that revenge can be its very own executioner. Two years after losing its founder, the Imamate was once again without a leader. The situation must have looked hopeless for the Murids. Imperial Russia was extending its presence in the area, buoyed by the Great Game rivalry with Britain. The Ottomans, who the Murids would have hoped to rely upon in their fight with a common foe, were too busy dealing with Muhammad Ali's incursions into the Levant. But amidst this dismal situation, the Imamate would find a new Imam, who would lead his followers to more success than they had ever enjoyed. That man was Shamil, the Lion of Dagestan. In 1834, the Imamate lay in ruins. That was until the dead man walking returned to the fight. Since that fateful day when Imam Ghazi was killed, Shamil had spent the last 2 years laying low and recovering, only keeping in contact with one of his wives. In this time, he lived alone in a small stone high in the mountains and next to a glacier, studying the Quran and preparing for his return. This period would have given him plenty of time to reflect on his life thus far. Born in 1797 to an Avar family, Shamil's original name was Ali. It was changed by his parents during his infancy when he became very weak and ill. It was a local tradition to rename children. Shamil's father, Dengao, was a wealthy landlord in and around Gimri, enabling the education of his son under Sarid of Arikani. The future leader remained quite weak and skinny into his teenage years, but is said to have made up for this with his quick intelligence. After some time of learning under Sarid, Ghazi Muhammad would take the slightly younger Shamil under his wing. The two men shared plenty of similarities, especially in religious belief and practice. Eventually, Ghazi Muhammad would outgrow the little town of Gimri and started a pilgrimage of preaching. He would walk hundreds of miles barefoot from town to town preaching on religious and political issues, especially his disdain for Russian ownership of Islamic lands. In Ghazi's absence, Shamil finally hit a growth spurt and grew into a physically gifted man. Caucasus culture relishes martial ability and physical strength of the individual warrior, so Shamil's repute grew with his stature. One particular story that is retold from his youth informs us that one night Shamil came home and found his father Dengao drunk. Shamil then pulled out his dagger and brandished it towards his father, telling him, "Watching you drink makes me want to kill myself." According to the story, Dengao never drank again after this. Replenished by his 2 years of rest, Shamil was quickly declared the third Imam after Hamza Bek's death. Meanwhile, the Russian army under the command of General Klugenau had established a new headquarters at Temirkhan Shura, just 6 kilometers east of Gyumri. From here, Klugenau marched out and resecured the vassalage of the Avar Khanate, placing a puppet ruler on the throne. But just as Russia had strengthened its position, it would become weak once again almost overnight. More than half of the forces sent to deal with Shamil would be redirected to fight the Circassian Confederation in the west. Both sides, in no shape to conduct any kind of campaign, decided to come to an unofficial truce, held together only by the word of Shamil and Klugenau. In the truce, Shamil would formally be given control of his mountain strongholds, while Klugenau retained control of Russian settlements in the area. This particularly helped Shamil, as his movement was severely weakened by the constant Russian operations. He fortified and entrenched his mountaintop villages and forests. The truce would last for the better part of a year and a half, until Russia fully invaded Chechnya and Dagestan in 1837. The Russians would split their forces into two. In response, Shamil mirrored this move, deciding to battle one of the two invading armies himself. One of the Russian contingents invaded into northern Chechnya, led by General Fessy. Meanwhile, General Klugenau led the other one into eastern Dagestan. Soon, many of his men fell victim to dysentery, and by the time he reached the canyon that overlooked Gyumri, Klugenau's company numbered less than 1,000 men. He would lose almost 200 soldiers in a single day when he came across a bridge that he wanted to inspect for ambush. Sending a scouting party to observe, they were all soon massacred by the Murids. The main invasion force had by this time bulldozed its way across Chechnya and into northern Dagestan, where it would meet Murid resistance at the fortified village of Ashitla. Shamil left 2,000 men to delay and bloody the fresh 5,000 strong army of the Russians. However, the Murids were forced to retreat after losing a few hundred men, as the Russians moved through the area with vengeance in mind, routinely attacking the villages indiscriminately. Soon after, the Russians besieged Fort Teleto, where Shamil had taken refuge with his Murids. A few weeks later, General Fessy finally arrived at the siege after dealing with constant Murid harassment. The only thing preventing the Russians from storming the fort were two watchtowers that Fessy's heavy cannon eventually shot down. The Russians then assaulted and took a large portion of the wall. The buildings inside of Teletul were then fought for house to house. This first assault cost Fessy more than 1,000 men. He, like General Klugenau, had his army slowly worn down to the point of exhaustion and surrender. At this point, Fessy had Shamil in his grasp and even in his sight. But with his army having been worn down to the point of exhaustion, Fessy ordered a complete withdrawal. If he had resumed the offensive, then this war would likely have been over 22 years early. Shamil made his trip back to Gyumri, but just before he made it home, he stopped to meet with General Klugenau once again, who asked for the meeting with the hope that Shamil would eventually meet the Tsar himself. The two parties met one another, and after a morning of failed negotiations, Klugenau decided to leave. As he stood up and extended his hand out to shake Shamil's, he was grabbed by a Murid who told him in no uncertain terms that non-believers should not touch the Imam. The man even began to pull a dagger out on Klugenau, but the two were quickly led away from one another by their own compatriots. The beginning of 1839 was dominated by a blitzkrieg of building for both sides, as Shamil ordered for the construction of a brand new fort right across a ravine from an already established fort called Akhulgo. The Russian building campaign was headed by General Golovin, who built a string of forts that stretched from the old Georgian military highway in the west to the Caspian Sea in the east. This would cut Shamil from expanding his borders further south. The Russians sought to cage him off as if you would with a wild animal. But Shamil had earned a nickname by this point that would reflect just how much difficulty the Tsar's men would face in subduing this foe. Over the next decade, the Lion of Dagestan was to etch his name into the history books with his military feats. In June 1839, the Lion was cornered in his recently built fort at New Akhulgo by General Count Pavel Graby. The Russians would have their work cut out for them. The fortress was almost impregnable, located on a hill on top of a mountain with a deep ravine below it. The main obstacle was a bridge that hung over the river beneath. As the Russians approached, Shamil ordered his men to burn the bridge, leaving him on his own fortified island among a sea of clouds. Naturally, General Graby prioritized rebuilding the bridge, and a few days later, Shamil was formally put under siege. The Russians had 13,500 men, whilst there was 1,000 Murids that were hemmed in with a few thousand civilians. Despite Murid attempts to break out, they were soon contained. The centerpiece that held New Akhulgo together was a massive watchtower that dominated the plateau it rested on. Any hope of taking the fort relied on the destruction or seizure of this tower, known by the locals as Surkhey's watchtower. General Graby ordered artillery bombardment to pummel the tower, overpowering the enemy with superior technology. Within a week, it was neutralized, spelling the beginning of the end for the Murids inside. The siege would continue for 2 more months until the fort was encircled and General Graby ordered a full advance. Seeing the pointlessness of fighting a losing battle, Shamil raised the white flag of surrender. Offering his 9-year-old son Jamaluddin as hostage to secure negotiations, Shamil met his Russian counterparts to discuss the terms of surrender. The negotiations bore no fruit, with Shamil storming out after being angered by Russian demands. General Graby, in no mood to be conciliatory, ordered a full assault on the broken fort, taking it within a few days. After holding out for almost 3 months, the Russians swarmed in. Only the women and children were spared. But there was one notable exception among the body count. The night before the fort was captured, Shamil, along with his pregnant wife and second-born son Ghazi Muhammad and a few Murids, were all lowered down from New Akhulgo into the river valley below. The next day, they started their retreat out of the canyon, but were caught by a few Russians. A fight broke out where Shamil, protecting his son, was wounded, but the Murids managed to overpower the Russians. Continuing this escape, this motley crew crossed the river. They'd eventually reach the Murid city of Dagestan in Chechnya, concluding another heroic escape. The rebellion was not going well for Shamil. He was sorely lacking in manpower after having been defeated so much recently. To help protect Avar lands in the Imam's absence was none other than the man who had killed the last Imam, Haji Murad. After the assassination of Hamza Bek, Murad had started to work for the Russians. But this deal quickly went sour as he was arrested due to being viewed as a possible threat, so he was escorted in chains to the Russian base of Temir Khan Shura. This path, like many in the area, was mountainous, winding, and full of February snow. Murad, not being one to accept his fate, then did something so bold and daring it begs belief. Despite being chained up, along the way, he jumped off the side of a mountain. Understandably, the Russians believed him to be dead. but Murad was a difficult man to kill. Driven by desperation, he had likely hedged his bets on the snow reducing the impact of the fall. And he was right. Miraculously, he survived. But whilst the snow had broken his fall, it had also broken several bones in his body. Now that he was wanted by Russia, Murad turned back to the Imamate that he had nearly destroyed just 6 years ago. Shamil accepted him into his cause, knowing that Murad's reputation for combat preceded him. But their relationship would prove to be tenuous in the long term. For the time being, however, his service under Shamil energized the Murid cause. During this time, his Russian foes gave him his own nickname, the Red Devil, due to his bright red clothing, the trademark color of the Avar Khanate, and his ferocious approach to war. By the summer of 1840, Shamil had managed to regain control over much of southern Chechnya. He would, however, fall victim to an assassination attempt around this time. After ordering a man to be punished by having one of his eyes gouged out, that same man would return and seek vengeance. One night, as Shamil slept, he was stabbed repeatedly by the punished man and his brothers. They would quickly be dealt with by Shamil's guards, but blood filled the Imam's bedsheets as he seemingly bled out. As extraordinary as this sounds, Shamil is said to have suffered more than 20 such wounds during his lifetime. As such, he would recover in a few months, swiftly organizing a new campaign in the process. Meanwhile, in Dagestan, Haji Murad's small force was discovered in their camp near Kunzakh by more than 2,000 Russian soldiers. The few hundred Avars hid behind barricades and inside of houses, defending this small village in the traditional house-to-house Murid fashion. This would prove highly effective, and the Russian army would be driven back, even losing their commander in the combat. 2 other notables met their fate here as well, Haji Murad's father and his last brother. This war had taken away Murad's whole family, foster and blood. He was now consumed by rage and an obsession for revenge. By the beginning of 1841, Shamil was ready to march south into Dagestan once again. There, the city of Gazimukh had defected to his cause, and so he travelled there to accept their alliance. Upon arriving, he also accepted the submission of another local chieftain, adding more to the replenished and growing Murid army. And just in time. General Grabi, the very man who Shamil had given his son to, assembled his own force to dislodge Shamil from his Chechen stronghold at Dargo. Shamil could not return in time, but he left one of his best generals behind with a handful of men to defend Dargo in this event. His name was Shuaib Mullah of Tesentara, soon to be known by Grabi as the Marshal of the Forests. The Russian general started his campaign in late spring of 1842 with a force of 10,000. They were harassed by guerrilla fighters from the beginning. Still, he pushed on, even as carts laden with supplies got stuck in the muddy ground. After a night of heavy rain, the general knew that he had been too cocky in his pursuit of Dargo and ordered a retreat. But this would be more casualty-filled than the advance. The result would be 1,700 Russians dead or wounded with minimal Murid casualties. Grabi, frustrated by the Murid's stubborn resolve, decided to resign his post as lead general of the front. He was replaced by General Neidgart, who immediately put out a bounty on Shamil equal to his head in gold. Hilariously, Shamil sent him a letter stating what an honor it was to be valued so highly, and that he wished that he could offer the same for Neidgart. With this new leadership, Shamil decided to lay low for a year, all the while planning his biggest campaign yet, the retaking of Dagestan. His last attempt had been thwarted, but by this time he had 8,000 more men with him. By September of 1843, Shamil had combined all of his forces, even Haji Murad's men, and was able to muster up 10,000 Murid fighters. General Klugenau and his 5,000 men decided to tactically withdraw to Kunzakh, which was largely converted into a Russian base by now. Shamil would be a fool to attack Kunzakh directly, but he still saw an exploitable weakness in the city's defense. There was only one road it received supplies from, and it connected to the other Russian base at Temirkhan Shura. Targeting this road would have forced the Russians to abandon their base. And that's exactly what happened. Klugenau ordered a retreat from Kunzakh and abandoned the city to Shamil's forces without a fight. This prompted an explosion of enlistment for Shamil, who now had all of Avaria backing him and more soldiers than he knew what to do with. He would put this martial energy to use by besieging every single Russian fort in the region in the months of November and December. It required the intervention of a huge Russian army headed by General Freytag to relieve all the cities and forts. But not before many of them, especially in Dagestan, fell into Shamil's hands. The reconquest of Dagestan was a success. This did, however, come at the cost of his Chechen stronghold. Even though the revolt had begun in Dagestan, Chechnya had become integral to the Murid cause. It supplied able soldiers and commanders such as Baysungur of Benoy, who supplemented the excellent leadership provided by Shamil. In the absence of the Imam, the Russians invaded southern Chechnya. Some villages fought back while many surrendered. Among those who did not fight was the village in which Shamil's elderly mother lived. She was naturally chosen to negotiate the surrender. She had little to say in the negotiations, but was given 2,000 Russian rubles as a forced bribe regardless. Under Shamil's Imamate, this was illegal. Accepting bribes were to be punished by 100 whips. As Shamil re-entered Chechnya to retake his stronghold, he was faced with the prospect of punishing his own mother. Upon retaking the village she lived in and learning of her forced treachery, Shamil disappeared for 3 days, deciding to pray on the matter. When he re-emerged, he reluctantly gave the order to have his own mother whipped 100 times. After only 5 lashes, the elderly woman fainted from the pain, so Shamil decided to take the remaining 95 lashes for her. Showing himself to be a leader that was willing to be punished by his subjects in the same manner he would punish them, only serving to add to his legendary status. The recent explosion of Murid military action did not go unnoticed in St. Petersburg, and Tsar Nicholas I immediately sent 26 new battalions to the front. In 1844, these battalions managed to push the Murids away from the Caspian Sea, once again containing Imam Shamil off to just his mountains and forests. The following year, even more attention was given to the front as the Tsar appointed General Vorontsov as the main commander in the Caucasus. Vorontsov was a noble made famous for his success fighting the retreating Napoleon after his failed invasion of Russia in 1812. He would take a more offensive position, so for his first campaign he set his sights on the Chechen stronghold of Dargo. Vorontsov believed that he had found a safer path to the Murid stronghold, but he was dead wrong. The campaign started in May 1845, as the 18,000 strong Russian force led by Vorontsov and aided by General Klugenau set off from Fort Vnizafia. The combat would begin to break out when the army entered the forests, but despite this, it went deeper and deeper into the dark woodlands. A week later, the army reached the Terek River. Vorontsov set a forward guard of 1,000 to camp a few miles upstream from the main force. On that night of June 6th, an out-of-season cold froze the land. The soldiers did not think to bring warm clothes with them, so they scrambled and huddled for warmth around small fires, as lighting larger ones might attract unwanted attention. By morning, over 450 of them woke up with frostbitten fingers, toes, and noses, whilst 500 horses laid cold and dead where they slept. A bad omen of things to come. The very place was now rejecting the Russian army. In addition to the harsh weather, they were also being ambushed every chance that the Murids got. By this point in the war, the Murids had perfected a number of tactics that best suited their guerrilla warfare strategy. Chief amongst these was the use of horse mountain artillery, or as the Russians referred to it, nomadic artillery. Shamil's naibs, especially the Chechen Talhig of Shali, had mastered this tactic of shooting at his Russian foes and then quickly moving the artillery on horse-drawn carriages to another location where they would resume firing. When the Russians would rush to the sounds of the artillery, they'd find no guns at the spot. Despite this, Vorontsov pushed on. By June 14th, the army finally reached their first checkpoint, the Andi Valley. The lush green valley would allow for the Russians to resupply and stockpile on food and supplies in preparation for the last half of their campaign. There was one problem with this plan, however. The Andi Valley had been scorched, all life being burnt out of the landscape by Shamil, who had seemingly guessed or known the Russian plan. Vorontsov, always the stubborn man, decided to go ahead with his plan regardless, attempting to stockpile supplies that the army used before a large surplus could even be built up. After 3 weeks of waiting in the blackened valley, Vorontsov set off to finally capture Dargo. The last push was only 20 kilometers, but the road ahead was nearly single file all the way and crawling with Murid forces. Eventually, his men pushed through and reached the outskirts of Dargo a few nights later. With no patience left, he ordered a night attack to take the town. But the town was curiously left sparsely defended. As the Russian advance party walked into the quiet, empty streets, everything erupted in flames as Shamil ordered the burning of his own stronghold. The whole Russian army quickly rushed in. Vorontsov thought he had won, except he had only been tricked. Shamil had taken a play straight out of the Russian military book, leaving his town abandoned and the army occupying it, isolated and cut off from their supply line. Ironically, this left Vorontsov in the same state as the Russian general had left Napoleon in Moscow some 30 years ago. The Russian army was playing right into Shamil's hands. The intrepid Imam stationed a few cannons on a mountainside and started to rain lead on Dargo. To add to the fear, Shamil ordered his drummers to start ominously playing Russian anthems from the cover of the nearby forests. After 3 days of sitting in Dargo, a supply caravan's flare was finally spotted a few miles away. Vorontsov only had food for 1 day left, so he sent his most experienced general, Klugenau, to secure the much-needed supplies. This column set off at dawn, immediately meeting resistance. Whole groups of men were cut off and shot down by Murids sharpshooters. The battered Russian force reached the caravan by the evening and turned to go back down the path that so many had just died on that morning. The Murids seemed even more numerous now and even targeted the supply train. To make matters worse, a heavy rain fell over the forest. Many of the wagons became stuck in the mud and abandoned by Klugenau, who prioritized the lives of his men over that of the supplies. The dark forest was made even more ominous by the lack of dead Russians from the previous day's march. They were simply nowhere to be found. At one point, the column came across 2 fallen trees. To the terror of Klugenau, hundreds of dead Russians filled the space in between the trees. The soldiers were then forced to march over their own dead comrades, some joining this mass grave as they went over the top. When the tattered and wounded men under Klugenau arrived back at Dargo, they had lost over 1,000 men and nearly all the supplies. Vorontsov then knew how dire his situation really was. Klugenau had brought only 2 more days' worth of food back with him, just enough to escape Dargo. On July 13th, the desperate Russian army made their move to escape the town that had become their prison. The shortest path to freedom was north, one that had not been previously traveled. The army marched through the forest for 3 days until meeting up with General Freytag, who once again saved the day. During those 3 days, an additional 1,000 died, and 2,000 more were added to the wounded list. When Freytag saw the force, he remarked that there were barely enough men left to carry out the wounded. The total Russian casualties over the 3-month-long campaign was 5,000 dead and 3,000 wounded, among them being 7 generals. This was by far the biggest Murid victory of the whole war. For the rest of 1845, Shamil was more than safe to do what he wished, and he wished to join with his Circassian brethren still in revolt in the west. The Kabardians are one of the 12 Circassian tribes who lived near the center of the North Caucasus Mountains. The area under their control could potentially allow for the combination of the 2 revolts. Up until this point, the Murid resistance had proved to be a major headache for the Tsar's men, but if the 2 revolts could somehow link up, it would undermine Russia's very presence in the region. So Shamil organized an expedition westward with high hopes. But these hopes were dashed when General Freytag arrived weeks before Shamil to ensure the loyalty of the Kabardians. With his offensive plans thwarted, Shamil decided to go back on the defensive. The war raged for the next few years as the Russians demonstrated their will to contain the revolt, constantly besieging Murid strongholds, even if it did come at the cost of thousands of Russian soldiers. Imam Shamil still stayed on the defensive and borderline inactivity as he seemingly sat waiting for Russian attacks. One of his commanders was still very much on the offensive though. This was of course the Red Devil, Haji Murad himself. He conducted frequent raids everywhere over the next 3 years. From 1849 to 1852, Murad raided his way across the Caucasus, making quite a name for himself in the process. He was starting to look more and more like the true face of this rebellion. Popular legend records that his fame and notoriety grew to the point the Murid armies would simply chant Haji Murad, and whole Russian contingents would surrender. Regardless of the truth behind this, Murad's rise did worry Shamil. Ultimately, Murad had killed the previous Imam, and his popularity almost threatened Shamil's. As a result, Shamil started to grow paranoid. Over time, this paranoia would make Shamil turn against his best commander. But Murad learned of this treachery, subsequently becoming a triple agent when he returned to his Russian captors. They welcomed him and offered protection for peace, which he accepted. They moved Murad to the city of Shaki in modern-day Azerbaijan. There he was basically on house arrest as he was always being watched by Russian spies. Eventually he grew tired and planned a successful escape. but his legendary tale had to end someday. A few weeks later, he was caught and after a life full of death and revenge, was finally executed. His legacy would be immortalized through the daring life he led, inspiring Leo Tolstoy to dedicate a semi-fictional novel about his life. To turn against Haji Murad was probably the biggest mistake that Shamil made. His second biggest mistake may have been to name his son Ghazi Muhammad as his heir and new commander. His son had far less experience than him, but was still handed more and more responsibility. In the meantime, during 1852, the Russians cut a massive path through the middle of the Imamate, literally cutting it in half with the axe. With the forest becoming the Murids' best weapon, Russia decided to target it directly, chopping trees and reducing the woodlands to prevent Shamil's men from using it for guerrilla warfare. The following year, the Murid cause received positive news when they heard about the start of the Crimean War. Russia was being attacked by the combined forces of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. With the Great Game fully underway, Shamil had already caught the attention of the British Empire, but he had never received any meaningful support from them. The Ottomans, united with the Murids by a common foe and religion, had also given Shamil little real support for his cause. He would constantly send diplomatic missions to both, requesting aid against the Tsar. If there was ever a time that Great Britain and the Ottomans would support Shamil, it would be right now. But they still left him to his own devices. As some consolation for Shamil, many Russian soldiers would be placed on the Crimean front instead of his own. This would lead to a campaign of more personal matters. On the 4th of July 1854, exactly 15 years after Surkhay's tower was taken at the siege of New Akhulgo, a special operations force headed by Ghazi Muhammad entered a Georgian royal palace and took 2 princesses captive. These were the granddaughters of the last king of Georgia. This would lead to a hostage exchange a year later in 1855, whereby the 2 princesses would be given back for Jamaluddin, who was to be returned to Shamil. After 15 years apart, this family was reunited. But Jamaluddin did not resemble his other brothers, and he could barely speak his native tongue. This was perhaps the last thing that Shamil wanted out of this rebellion, as all offensive attempts to fight Russian armies ceased from this point forward. Unfortunately, before the war could end, Jamaluddin would die, still feeling like an outsider in his own native land. In 1856, the Crimean War would end, leaving Shamil's front as a priority once again. General Baryatinsky and 40,000 Russian soldiers then continued to cut vast portions of the forest in the Imamate over the next 3 years, reducing Shamil's influence to only Dagestan. Seeing this massive army meant that many of Shamil's allies surrendered. All the while, Shamil kept running southwards from his inevitable fate. Eventually, he could go no further south and reached his final fort at Guneb. On August 9, 1859, the fort would be put under siege. Shamil, who had fought and escaped his whole life, decided that he had had enough of war. His followers only numbered 50 at this point, with only a handful of capable warriors among them. On August 25, 1859, after 30 years of rebellion, Imam Shamil would surrender, leaving thousands of dead Russians, miles of cut-down forests, and one Imam who against all odds tried his best to win an unwinnable war. After the end of the war, Shamil would spend the next 10 years exiled in the Russian Empire, even meeting Tsar Alexander II in person. By all accounts, the Russian authorities seemed to have made his exile a comfortable one, even allowing him to make the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. Probably 70 years old at this point, Shamil would board a boat in 1869 that took him from Odessa in modern-day Ukraine to Constantinople, where he became a guest of the Ottoman Sultan Abdulaziz. From there he sailed to Mecca, where he completed a lifelong dream to become a Haji. Whilst in the Holy City, Shamil would meet another great Muslim warrior who resisted European imperialism. To tell us more, we go to my collab partner, Stoic History.
When compared to anyone else in their lifetimes, Imam Shamil and Emir Abdelkader may have just been the two most similar men in the world, despite growing up more than 1,000 miles away from each other. Both men were followers of a Sufi sect of Islam. Shamil followed the Naqshbandi sect, while Abdelkader followed the Qadiriya order. Neither of these men were born into nobility, Shamil being declared as Imam in 1834, while Abdelkader was declared as the Emir of Algeria in 1831. Both men rose to power due to the invasions of European colonial powers, with Shamil fighting the Russians and Abdelkader fighting against the French. As military tacticians, both men engaged their foe in a guerrilla-style war. Shamil used the mountains, forests, and valleys of the Caucasus to his advantage, while Abdelkader used the deserts, oases, and mountains of Algeria for his own advantage. Both men fought off the much larger colonial powers for decades. Eventually, both would be defeated. Shamil in 1859 and Abdelkader in 1847. Both of these men even won respect from these same colonial oppressors that they had fought against. Now, in 1869, they both sat as old men in Mecca, with a lifetime of heroic stories behind them. The conversation these two shared would have truly been something to behold. If you want to learn more about Abdelkader, consider checking out the video that I made on him right after watching this one. Shortly after meeting with Emir Abdelkader, Imam Shamil would move to Medina, where he would die 2 years later in 1871.
Thank you guys for watching. Make sure you go check out Curiosity Stream. The link is in the description below. As usual, big thank you to my patrons for continuing to support me. If you want to become a patron and help Hikmah History grow, check out the link in the description below. I have to give a massive shout out to my guy Marshall from Stoic History for his invaluable help on the script for this video. Don't forget to check out his channel. He makes awesome content about a range of regions, specifically the Caucasus area. Until next time, peace!